paper I wrote was on the challenges confronting the New Zealand pastoral sector, and one of the major issues related to that is around productivity. And we all know that increasing feed supply from pasture really is one of those underlying criteria for ensuring that productivity is improved on farm. We've got climate change affecting us. We're not sure whether that's going to be a positive or a negative, but we do know that increasing feed supply from pasture is driven by a number of factors, including plant breeding and the use of appropriate species, astute management decisions, which as farmers and the audience you undertake, and increasing levels of input such as fertiliser, pesticides, fungicides, and the use of irrigation, which we've just heard about. I want to talk to you about the plant breeding part of those that I listed. Now, in some countries, it's a legislative requirement to evaluate new forage cultivars to determine whether they're firstly distinct and can be protected through plant variety rights, and whether they actually add value over the existing cultivars. In New Zealand, we don't have such a system at all. We have a system that's voluntary for cultivar evaluation that is managed by the New Zealand Plant Breeding and Research Association. Now, the benefits of pasture renewal have been quantified in a number of studies, but many of those have shown that improvement to be over the renewal of the worst paddocks on a farm. A few years ago, the Forage Value Index was instigated to try and rate and quantify the value of new cultivars for farmers to identify what cultivars they should use on their farms. That system was halted this year due to results from a farm systems trial not being able to differentiate between higher and lower ranking cultivars. When it was based on yield in small plots, which in fact did show those differences, we were unable to transfer those yields from small plots to paddock scale, or in fact maybe use management systems that captured the yield difference. And in this case it was a dairy farm, and you can see that graph on the top right, showing that in fact there was no difference between those high and low ranking perennial ryegrass cultivars in this case. As a result of that, Dave Chapman and I had started a review right back at the beginning of 2024 to look at ways of evaluating pasture forage plant breeding achievements. And it's that review paper that in fact I'm going to talk about, and it was that topic that I was asked to in fact provide a paper for this conference, but of course we already had one very nearing completion, and hence why the paper you've got on your proceedings is somewhat different. In summary, plant breeding aims to increase on-farm productivity through improved seasonal and annual yield, persistence of yield in perennials over time, so that yield does not drop as pastures age, and increasing nutrient value and feeding value. Breeding is generally undertaken in relatively controlled environments, whether plants are in space plants or in rows. And we often know that the correlation of those trait values in space plants and sward plots is often quite low and non-significant. Having said that, we also understand that the heritability of a lot of important traits can actually be moderate to high, which means that plant breeders can, with some certainty, select for those traits of value. Significant and lasting improvements have been achieved, and that graph, which was published quite a number of years ago now, shows the improvement in yield, and in this case it's white clover, and also the proportion of clover in the sward from cultivars that were bred right back in the 1930s through to the 1990s. And even if you look at other forages such as ryegrass, those plot trials where you have all the cultivars growing in the same environment at the same time and managed in exactly the same way show something in the order of 6 to 15% increases in yield per decade within the the species. So we do know that plant breeding can make a difference. So why can't we show this when we test it on farm? And this is the point that on some farmer grazing trials measured animal performance support that improvement in yield and vigour of our cultivars, but in some others they don't. And the review that Dave and I undertook looked at what some of those factors might be that give us these differing results. And these might include aspects of systems management, the way the systems trials are designed, and all the breeding objectives and evaluation systems that we used when the breeding was undertaken. Environmental stresses, so if you had a severe drought, that's really going to dumb down any differences you might expect between cultivars. Insufficient statistical power, in other words, not enough replicates, and scaling interactions that restrict or dilute trait expression. So I said earlier on that plant breeding aims to deliver high-yielding, high-quality, persistent pastures that deliver increased on-farm productivity. And the ultimate demonstration of that, of course, is on-farm rather than in plant breeders' plots. In the review, we looked at 28 whole farm systems comparing forages of varying types, be that either cultivars or epicloe endophyte strains. In that comparison, we had 5 comparing white clover cultivars, 15 comparing ryegrass cultivars, and 8 comparing grasses with different epicloe endophyte strains. And this is largely what that showed. So in the first column there, obviously species, the second column is the number of trials that compared those species, and then the number of trials which showed a difference, and then the last column is the percentage demonstrating that difference. You can see that for the majority we're getting 75–80% of the trials showing yes, there was a positive effect of a difference between those cultivars in the direction you might expect. When you looked at the different grazing systems, however, the majority of those were in the sheep and beef comparisons, and only half of the dairy comparisons showed that expected difference. So we go on to look at what factors can be controlled via experimental design that might help ensure that we do get that carryover effect that we're seeing in small plots with what we might expect on these paddock scale or farm scale trials. Overgrazing of farmlet swards can result in poor alignment of feed supply and demand, so you want to make sure you're managing that pasture in an effective way. The wrong choice of cultivars. So maybe the cultivars you chose to compare, in fact, weren't as different as you thought they were. The extensive use of conserved feeds or imported supplements may very well dilute the difference that you might expect to see between the different cultivars. Farmlet management system is prescribed and doesn't actually allow or is inflexible with regard to the different way in which those cultivars in fact grow. I've already mentioned insufficient statistical power replication, and maybe in fact we need multiple trials across a range of sites to see some of those differences expressed. And then if you're talking about ryegrass, you might very well completely dumb down those differences by either having too low or too high levels of nitrogen, or maybe the incorporation of clover, again, does restrict or dilute the trait expression when you're looking at ryegrass. So these are some of the factors that you would need to keep in mind when setting up these on-farm systems. So there may be some factors that are largely beyond our control. Obviously climatic events, and I've already mentioned how drought, and particularly if it's in combination with insect pests, could in fact negate those differences that you might expect between cultivars. Greater spatial variation and temporal variation, this relates to that statistical power where you might have variation in soil type, water holding capacity, etc. And then phenotypic expression, where in fact some plants respond better to frequent grazing compared to others with infrequent grazing. Other factors beyond our control, breeding in monocultures and as space plants. So this is, I guess, a message to the plant breeders, or under lax defoliation may be very different to the environment in which a farmer in fact uses that cultivar. Pasture breeding may be too focused on improving yield, and it's also been pointed out that in fact yield may be so complex that it's in fact a very difficult phenomenon for reliable and long-term selection. I don't necessarily agree with that, but there is a view out there of that being the case. So forage plant breeding is an important capability, and we want to look at opportunities and challenges for plant breeding. That they will be reliant on a number of factors. Long-term adequate funding to support plant breeding. Breeding programs need to be managed in realistic environments, and I can't stress that enough, that in fact if we want our cultivars to in fact deliver the promise that we've seen in our breeding trials, we need to select for them in realistic environments that a farmer would have on his farm or her farm. Developing cultivars with environmental benefits and the ability to adapt to changing environments, and that's been quite a difficult aim for plant breeders to attempt to achieve. And lastly, improving nutritive value and quality. Further opportunities or challenges might include some of the more modern techniques that we have available to us in plant breeding, using genomic sequencing along with genomic marker technologies, the use of genetic modification and gene editing to introduce completely new traits into our forages. There's been a long history of man manipulating plants over about 10,000 years, and it's interesting, as we've got more and more accurate in the way we do that, it's become more and more regulated. But I won't deviate onto that topic at the moment, but it is one that is of concern, that in fact as we get to a point where we can in fact identify specific traits and genes associated with those traits, and we understand the impact of them, we have a regulation system which in fact does not allow us to use that technology effectively in New Zealand. And there may be new methods of plant trait evaluation and analysis, or phenomics, which allow us to measure traits more easily, and we can in fact have more plants that will allow us better replication. Opportunities and challenges for forage breeding could be reliant on, for grasses, integrated plant genetics with the obligate mutualist endophyte epicloe. This is particularly important in the North Island, but also in some parts of the South Island. Continued improvement for persistence of forage plants and ensuring cost-effective seed production. That photo on the right there is comparing a set of ryegrass cultivars with different epicloe endophytes in the Waikato, and you can see the devastating effect of the combination of drought and insect pests. These opportunities and challenges are also reliant on increasing expression of secondary metabolites that aid plant survival and or improve animal health and welfare, and some of that is associated with the epicloe endophyte. And also better understanding root traits of value for increasing plant adaptation to biotic and abiotic stressors. And look, measuring plant traits is incredibly difficult. Doing it in environments which are not realistic doesn't help. But then when you actually go out into the field, how on earth do you easily measure root system traits? It is an ongoing challenge that we really haven't cracked as yet. So just for a concluding comment, drivers of natural selection and plant breeding are actually diametrically opposed. Natural selection is really seeking for a plant to survive, either to do that vegetatively, or if it's an annual through seed production. Whereas as plant breeders, what we're looking for are increased yields in addition to persistence. And those two traits are often diametrically opposed, and different plant traits that contribute to those outcomes can be quite different. Selection of genotypes to develop cultivars should be made in the target environment. I've already stressed this, I can't stress it enough, that we need to make sure that particularly for our pastures, it's done under grazing and interplant competition. Any disconnect between plant breeding achievements and their subsequent on-farm impact suggests suggests ensure cultivars destined for use in grazed mixed species pastures are selected in the appropriate environment. And secondly, the management system, so that's a message to the plant breeder, but then to the farm systems person, make sure that the management systems are designed that effectively extract benefits and improvements from plant breeding endeavours. Thank you very much.